A lonely farmer was ready to give up everything. His wife was gone. His land was dying. His heart had turned as barren as the cracked earth beneath his boots. Then, one freezing October night, a mysterious black horse appeared at his gate, wild-eyed, starving, and carrying scars that told stories no one wanted to hear. He took her in, fed her, named her Midnight. He thought he was saving her. He had no idea she would soon save his life in a way he never expected. And that one terrible night, when her screams shattered the silence of the valley, he would discover something in the darkness that would change everything. Before we begin, subscribe and like this video to help us bring more emotional stories from the heartland. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's begin. The rooster hadn't crowed in 3 days. Elijah Kane stood at the window of his farmhouse, watching the gray light of dawn crawl across the dying wheat fields of the Shenandoah Valley. The silence didn't bother him anymore. Nothing bothered him anymore. 53 years old. Widowed. Alone. The farmhouse behind him creaked and groaned, as though it too was tired of standing. Paint peeled from the walls like old skin. The floorboards sagged beneath his weight, worn thin by generations of Kanes who had walked these halls. All of them gone now, swallowed by time and trouble. Margaret had been dead 14 months. Cancer had taken her slowly, cruelly, one piece at a time, until all that remained was a woman who weighed less than a child, whose hand felt like paper in his rough farmer's palm. He had held that hand until it went cold. Then he had buried her beneath the old oak tree on the hill, next to the grave of the son they had lost at birth 20 years before. Now Elijah was the last Kane, the end of a line that had worked this land for 4 generations. He should sell. That's what everyone said. The bank had sent letters. Polite at first, then less so. The property taxes were 3 years overdue. The tractor hadn't run since spring. Half the fencing was down, and the remaining cattle, just 12 head now, down from 60, wandered wherever they pleased. But Elijah couldn't sell. This land was all he had left to Margaret. Her garden still grew wild near the porch, choked with weeds but stubbornly alive. Her initials were carved into the barn door, place of the summer they were married, when everything still felt possible. He turned from the window and shuffled toward the kitchen. The coffee pot sat empty on the counter. He couldn't remember the last time he'd bothered to make a full pot. What was the point of coffee when you had nowhere to be? Outside, the wind picked up. October in the Shenandoah Valley was unpredictable, warm one day, bitter the next. Tonight, according to the old radio he kept on the counter, a storm was coming, the first major one of the season. Elijah didn't care. He ate his breakfast standing up. 2 slices of bread, no butter, washed down with water from the tap that tasted faintly of rust. Through the kitchen window, he could see the old barn, its red paint faded to a dusky pink. The doors hung crooked on their hinges. He should fix those doors before winter. He wouldn't. The day passed away, all his days passed now, in a haze of small tasks that accomplished nothing. He walked the property lines out of habit, not purpose. He stood in the empty chicken coop, remembering when it had held 30 hens, back when Margaret would collect eggs every morning, humming hymns under her breath. He sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to black. The storm arrived around midnight. Elijah was in bed but not sleeping. He rarely slept anymore, just drifted in and out of gray consciousness, when the first rumble of thunder shook the farmhouse. He lay there, listening to the rain begin its assault on the roof, thinking about nothing and everything. Then he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm like a blade through flesh. A horse, screaming. Elijah sat up in bed, his heart suddenly pounding. Sometimes horses neigh so loudly that it sounds more like a scream. This is a distress signal, expressing an emotional state described by neuroscientist Jake Panskep as panic/grief. He hadn't owned a horse in years, not since the old mare Bonnie had died of colic the winter before Margaret got sick. The sound came again, closer now, a raw, terrified shriek that seemed to come from the direction of the front gate. Elijah threw off his blankets and grabbed a shotgun he kept beside the bed. He pulled on his boots without bothering to tie them and stumbled through the dark house, knocking his hip against the kitchen table, cursing under his breath. Lightning flashed as he opened the front door, and there, Standing at his gate was a horse, black as midnight, soaked to the bone, eyes rolling white with terror. The animal screamed again, rearing up on her hind legs, her hooves slashing at the air. Only experienced equestrians should handle a screaming horse. A human can easily be knocked to the ground by a horse who whirls suddenly in a state of panic while screaming. Rain streamed down her flanks in silver rivers. Even from the porch, 30 feet away, Elijah could see that something was terribly wrong. The horse was thin, not just thin but skeletal. Her ribs jutted out like the bars of a cage, and there were marks on her body, visible even in the fractured light of the storm. Long, thin scars that crossed her shoulders and flanks. Whip marks. Someone had beaten this horse. Beaten her badly and often. She reared again, and this time Elijah saw something else. A rope, frayed and filthy, dangling from her neck. She had been tied somewhere, and she had broken free. "Easy," Elijah called out, his voice rusty from disuse. "Easy, girl." The horse's ears swiveled toward him. She stopped rearing, but her whole body trembled. A frightened horse may shake to express their fear. You will often see this behavior if the horse cannot move away from the scary object and feels trapped. For a long moment, man and horse stared at each other through the driving rain. Then the horse took one step toward him. And another. And another. Elijah lowered the shotgun. He didn't know where this horse had come from or who had hurt her so badly. He didn't know why she had chosen his gate, his farm, out of all the farms in the valley. But as he walked toward her through the rain, his boots sinking into the mud, his shirt soaking through to his skin, something shifted in his chest. A crack in the numbness that had consumed him for 14 months. This horse needed him. It had been a very long time since anything had needed Elijah Kane. "All right," he said softly, reaching out to touch her trembling neck. "All right, girl. I've got you." Lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled across the valley like the voice of God. But Elijah Kane didn't hear it. He was already leading the black horse toward the barn, one hand on her neck, feeling her pulse racing beneath his palm. He didn't know it yet, couldn't possibly know, but this horse would save his life. And what he would see in the darkness 3 weeks from now would change everything he thought he knew about courage, loyalty, and the strange ways fate brings broken souls together. What was this horse running from? And why did she choose Elijah's farm? The barn was cold and dark, and it smelled of old hay and forgotten things. Elijah pulled open the crooked doors with one hand, keeping the other pressed against the black horse's neck. She trembled beneath his touch, but didn't bolt. "In here," he murmured. "You're safe now." Safe. The word felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't felt safe in a very long time. But somehow, saying it to this frightened creature made it feel almost true. He led her into the barn and found an old lantern hanging from a nail. It took 3 tries to light it. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold or something else, he couldn't say. When the flame finally caught, golden light spilled across the barn's interior, illuminating years of neglect. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like funeral veils. The stall stood empty, their wooden gates gray with dust. In the corner, rusted tools lay scattered where Elijah had left them months ago, abandoned mid-task when he simply couldn't find the strength to continue. But the horse didn't seem to notice any of it. She stood perfectly still now, her head hanging low, exhaustion written in every line of her body. In the better light, Elijah could see just how badly she had been treated. The scars were worse than he'd thought. Some were old, faded silver lines that spoke of years of abuse. Others were newer, still raw and angry, barely healed. Some horses have learned to fear particular objects, tasks, or situations because of bad experience. Abused and neglected horses have learned not to trust people because of negative experiences. This makes it very easy for them to be afraid of all people, even when rescued. "Who did this to you?" Elijah whispered. The horse's ears twitched, but she didn't lift her head. He worked slowly, carefully, the way Margaret had taught him years ago when they'd first started keeping horses. He found an old blanket in the tack room, musty but dry, and draped it over the horse's trembling back. He filled a bucket with rainwater from the barrel outside the barn door and set it in front of her. She drank deeply, desperately, as though she hadn't tasted water in days. Food was harder. The hay in the barn was old, and Elijah worried it might make her sick. But it was all he had. He pulled apart a bale and spread it in an empty stall, then stood back and watched as she approached it cautiously, sniffing the air. She ate, slowly at first, then more eagerly. Elijah leaned against the stall door and watched her, the lantern throwing their shadows against the barn wall in strange, elongated shapes. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but in here, in this forgotten barn on a failing farm, something felt different. He didn't know this horse, didn't know her name, or where she'd come from, or what horrors she'd endured. But he knew what it felt like to be broken, to be so beaten down by life that every breath felt like an act of defiance. "Midnight," he said suddenly. The horse lifted her head and looked at him. Her eyes, dark as the storm outside, held a question. "That's why I'm going to call you," Elijah said. "Midnight, because that's when you found me." The horse held his gaze for a long moment. Then she lowered her head and returned to her hay. Elijah smiled. It was a small smile, barely a twitch of his lips, but it was the first smile that had crossed his face in 14 months. The storm lasted 3 days. Elijah spent most of that time in the barn with Midnight. He cleaned out the stall properly, replacing the old hay with fresh bedding he bought from the feed store in town, his first trip to town in weeks. He treated her wounds as best he could, applying salve to the worst of the cuts and whispering apologies for every wind she made. She was skittish at first. Every sudden movement made her flinch. Every loud noise sent her pressing against the far wall of the stall, her eyes wide with fear. Horses are prey animals, so instinctively they flee from something they perceive as dangerous or life-threatening. This also means they are constantly watching for threatening things. Most horse owners associate bolting or shying with fear, but there are several other ways horses show fear physically, including widened eyes, flaring nostrils, shaking, and stomping. But slowly, gradually, she began to trust him. On the second day, she let him brush her coat without trembling. On the third day, when he entered the barn, she lifted her head and nickered softly. The sound a horse makes to say, "Yes, come closer." Many horses nicker when approached by their favorite human. "Good morning to you, too," Elijah said, and felt that unfamiliar smile tug at his lips again. On the fourth day, the storm finally broke. The sun emerged from behind the clouds, pale and watery, but warm enough to dry the mud. Elijah led Midnight out of the barn for the first time, keeping a lead rope loosely in his hand. She stepped into the sunlight and stopped, lifting her head to feel the warmth on her face. Her nostrils flared as she breathed in the smell of wet earth and growing things. For a moment, she looked almost regal, a black queen surveying her kingdom. Then she turned her head and looked at Elijah, and something passed between them. Something wordless but profound. A recognition, perhaps, an understanding. "We are the same," that look seemed to say. "We are both survivors of storms." That night, Elijah did something he hadn't done in 14 months. He cooked a real dinner. Nothing fancy, just fried eggs and toast, and sunken beans he found in the back of the pantry. But he ate it at the kitchen table, on a real plate, with a fork and knife. And when he was done, he washed the dishes and put them away. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the barn. The door was open just a crack. He'd left it that way so Midnight could see the stars, and he could see the faint glow of the lantern he'd left burning for her. "Thank you," he said quietly. He wasn't sure who he was talking to, the horse or Margaret or God, or all three, but the words felt right. So he said them again. "Thank you." The first sign that something was wrong came a week later. Elijah was in the barn, grooming Midnight, when he noticed her ears suddenly prick forward. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring, and stared at the barn door. Snorting has several meanings in communication, and must be interpreted depending on the situation. A loud, repeated snort is an indication to conspecifics that danger is imminent. With a loud snort that sounds a bit like a snore, they want to say, "Be careful, I'm not sure if it's safe here." Midnight snorted once, twice. Then she began to pace in her stall, her hooves thudding against the wooden floor. "What is it, girl?" Elijah asked. Then he heard it too, the sound of a truck engine, growling up the dirt road that led to his farm. Elijah walked to the barn door and looked out. A black pickup truck was pulling up to the farmhouse. It was caked with mud, the kind of mud that came from back roads and hidden places. The windows were tinted dark. Two men got out. They were big, broad-shouldered, and thick-necked, with the kind of faces that had seen violence and dealt it. One of them carried a coiled rope. The other carried something else. A whip. Elijah's blood went cold. "You Kane?" the one with the whip called out. His voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man who was used to getting what he wanted, who's asking. "Name's Harlan Vickers. I'm looking for a horse. Black mare. Ran off from my property about 2 weeks ago." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Heard from some folks in town that you might have found her." Behind him, in the barn, Elijah heard Midnight scream. It was the same sound she had made that first night, raw, terrified, primal. The sound of an animal that knew its tormentor had found it. Harlan Vickers heard it too. His smile widened. "Sounds like you found her." What would Elijah do? Give her back to the men who had broken her? Or stand against them, alone, outmatched and afraid? Elijah Kane had not been a brave man for a very long time. The war had taken that out of him. Vietnam, 1969. A tour that had left with a scar on his shoulder and a darkness in his mind that never fully lifted. He had come home and buried himself in farm work, in Margaret's love, in the quiet rhythms of the land. He had avoided conflict whenever possible, backed down from arguments, let bigger men have their way. But now, standing in the autumn sunlight with Harlan Vickers' shadow falling across his boots, something stirred in Elijah's chest. Something old, something that felt like fire. "She's not yours any more," he heard himself say. Vickers stopped smiling. "Excuse me." "You heard me." Elijah's voice was steady, though his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. "I've seen the marks on that horse. I know what you did to her. She's not going back." The other man, younger, meaner looking, with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, stepped forward. "Old man, you don't want to do this." "Maybe not," Elijah said, "but I'm doing it anyway." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind stirred the dead leaves in the yard, sending them skittering across the dirt like frightened animals. In the barn behind him, Midnight had gone silent, but Elijah could feel her watching through the crack in the door. Then Vickers laughed. It was an ugly sound, wet and thick. "You're brave," he said. "Stupid, but brave. That horse cost me $3,000. She's my property. I've got papers. Papers don't make something right. Papers make something legal. And legal is all that matters out here." Vickers nodded to his companion. "Go get her." The young man started toward the barn. Elijah stepped into his path. "Move," the young man said. "No." The punch came fast, faster than Elijah expected. It caught him in the jaw and sent him stumbling backward, his boots slipping in the dirt. He tasted blood. The world tilted, but he didn't fall. He caught himself on the fence post, breathing hard, and turned to face them again. "That the best you got?" The young man's face twisted with anger. He raised his fist again. "Enough!" The voice came from the road. All three men turned. A woman stood there, middle-aged, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains. She wore a sheriff's uniform, and her hand rested on the gun at her hip. "Sheriff Dawes," Vickers said, his voice suddenly smooth as oil. "We were just having a friendly conversation. Didn't look friendly from where I was sitting." The sheriff walked toward them, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Got a call from Martha, at the feed store. Said you boys were asking around about a horse. Said you looked like trouble." "No trouble here," Vickers said. "Just retrieving my property." "That's so." Sheriff Dawes looked at Elijah. "This man's got a claim on a horse of yours." Elijah wiped the blood from his lip. "He's got papers. But that horse has been beaten half to death. I've seen the scars. He's not fit to own an animal." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. She looked at Vickers, then at the whip, still coiled in his hand. "That true, Harlan?" "That horse is high-strung," Vickers said. "Sometimes discipline is necessary." "Discipline." The sheriff said the word, like it left a bad taste in her mouth. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to Elijah. Here's the situation, Mr. Kane. Legally, if this man has papers, that horse is his property. I can't stop him from taking her. That's the law. Elijah's heart sank. But, the sheriff continued, if there's evidence of animal cruelty, I can open an investigation. That investigation could take weeks, months, even, and during that time, the animal would need to stay somewhere safe. She looked at the barn. Somewhere like here. Elijah understood. I'd be willing to provide that safe place, Sheriff. I thought you might. She turned back to Vickers. You want that horse, Harlan? Get a lawyer. Go through the proper channels. But if I find out you've been within a mile of this farm before that investigation's complete, I'll arrest you for trespassing. And I'll make sure the whole county knows what kind of man you are. Vickers's face had gone red. A vein pulsed in his temple. This isn't over, he said. Maybe not, the sheriff replied. But it's over for today. Now get off this man's property. They left. The black truck roared away in a cloud of dust. But Elijah knew Vickers would be back. Men like him always came back. Sheriff Dawes stayed for a few minutes, taking down information and giving Elijah her card. He's dangerous, she said quietly when they were alone. Harlan Vickers has connections. Money, friends in low places. You sure you want this fight? Elijah looked at the barn, through the open door. He could see Midnight watching him, her dark eyes filled with something that might have been hope. I'm sure, he said. The sheriff nodded. All right, then. I'll do what I can on my end. But you keep your eyes open, Mr. Kane, and maybe think about getting some help out here. You're a long way from your nearest neighbor. After she left, Elijah went to the barn. Midnight met him at the stall door, pressing her nose against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her neck and held her, feeling her warmth, her heartbeat, the steady rhythm of her breathing. I'm not letting you go, he whispered. I promise, whatever it takes. The horse nickered softly, and Elijah could have sworn she understood. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Elijah repaired the fence around the main pasture, working from dawn until dusk. He fixed the barn doors properly for the first time in years. He bought new locks for the gates and installed motion sensor lights near the house. And he began training Midnight. It started slowly. Simple things like leading her around the pasture, getting her used to his voice and his touch. She was smart, he discovered. Smarter than any horse he'd ever known. She learned commands quickly, responded to the slightest pressure on the lead rope, seemed to anticipate what he wanted before he asked. Horses are herd animals and need you to be a strong leader. If your horse does not look to you for leadership, they likely don't trust you or your decisions. In the wild, the herd survival depended on strength and trust in the herd. Being the leader your horse needs you to be not only build a bond based on respect, but your horse will also trust you to handle scary situations. By the end of the first week, she would come when he called her name. By the end of the second week, she let him ride her. It was a strange feeling, sitting on her back for the first time. Elijah hadn't ridden a horse in years, and his muscles screamed in protest. But Midnight was patient. She walked slowly, carefully, adjusting her gait to his uncertain balance. You're taking care of me, he realized one evening, as they walked along the ridge overlooking the valley. Aren't you? Midnight tossed her head, and Elijah laughed. Actually laughed. The sound surprised him, so much he almost fell off. But not everything was peaceful. Twice that week, Elijah woke to find fresh tire tracks on the dirt road near the farm. Once, he found a dead rabbit on his porch, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. A message, a warning. He told Sheriff Dawes, and she increased her patrols. But they both knew she couldn't be everywhere. The valley was wide, and Elijah's farm sat at the end of a long, lonely road. On the 14th night, he went to bed with a shotgun beside him and the windows locked tight. He fell asleep around midnight, dreaming of Margaret, of the way she used to hum in the garden, of the softness of her voice when she said his name. Then Midnight screamed. Elijah was on his feet before he was fully awake, the shotgun in his hands, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran to the window and looked out. The barn door was open, and there in the moonlight, he saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A man, standing in the pasture, holding a can of gasoline, and behind him, flames were already climbing the side of the barn. The fire was spreading fast. Midnight was trapped inside, and Elijah had only seconds to decide. Save himself, or risk everything to save the horse that had given him a reason to live again. The smell hit him first. Acrid, chemical, wrong. Gasoline and smoke and burning wood, mixing in a poisonous cocktail that seared his lungs. Elijah didn't think. He threw open the door and sprinted toward the barn. The man with the gasoline can saw him coming and vanished into the darkness beyond the pasture fence. The fire had already consumed the barn's eastern wall, hungry flames licking up the old wooden boards with terrifying speed. Decades of dry hay and neglected maintenance, all fuel now, and Midnight was still inside. Her screams cut to the roar of the flames, raw, panic shrieks that made his blood run cold. A horse will scream while the mouth is open. Its ears will be upright. So, if you hear it scream, know that it's in pain or danger. I'm coming. Elijah shouted. He yanked open the barn door. A wall of smoke hit him like a fist. Through the haze, he could see Midnight in her stall, rearing, her hooves striking the wooden gate again and again. Elijah pulled his shirt over his mouth and plunged into the inferno. The heat blistered his arms. Every breath was agony. He navigated by memory and the sound of her screams until he reached her stall and fumbled with the latch. The metal burned his fingers, but he didn't let go. The latch clicked open. Midnight burst out like a black comet, nearly knocking him down. He grabbed her mane and let her momentum carry him toward the door. Around them, beams crashed down, walls buckled. They made it through just as the roof collapsed. The impact threw them both to the ground. When Elijah looked up, the barn was nothing but a tower of flame reaching toward the stars. Midnight stood nearby, trembling but alive. He crawled to her and wrapped his arms around her neck. "I've got you," he whispered. Sheriff Dawes arrived with the fire department. There was nothing to save. "Vickers?" she asked. "Who else?" "I'll bring him in. But without witnesses, without proof." "I know." The next weeks were brutal. Elijah built a temporary shelter from tarps and salvaged lumber. The insurance payout would take months. He sold his cattle to buy feed for Midnight and keep the electricity running. He slept with a shotgun beside his bed. Sometimes he heard trucks slowing on the road. Once, he found footprints near the fence that weren't his own. Vickers was watching, waiting, but Elijah was preparing. He trained Midnight every day, building her strength and trust. She learned to come when he whistled. She learned to stand perfectly still on command. She learned to move in darkness without sound. Building trust is one of the most critical elements of eliminating the fear threshold. This takes time, patience, and some effort to lean into your horse's needs. Most importantly, she learned to trust him absolutely, the way a soldier trusts a man guarding his back. The first snow came in early November. Elijah was checking the shelter when Midnight suddenly tensed, staring at the tree line. A horse's snort is an alarm. If a horse does it and holds his head high, he has detected a threat. She snorted sharply. At the edge of the woods, a figure stood watching. It raised one hand, a wave or a threat, then disappeared into the trees. "He's not going to stop," Elijah said quietly. Midnight pressed her nose against his shoulder. That night, he made his decision. The odds were impossible. But impossible odds had never stopped him before. The war had come to his doorstep. And this time, he wasn't running. It was a Tuesday when they came. The moon hung full and heavy over the valley, casting silver light across the snow. Elijah couldn't sleep. He lay in darkness, waiting for something he couldn't name. Then Midnight screamed, not terror, but warning. A scream is a rare and intense sound a horse makes as a last resort threat or warning. It's a loud, gut-wrenching noise that signals something is very wrong. Elijah grabbed the shotgun and ran to the window. 3 trucks, headlights cutting through darkness, coming fast. He pulled on his boots and ran outside. Midnight was at the fence, pawing the snow, eyes fixed on the approaching lights. The truck stopped. 7 men emerged, shadows against the headlights. At their head stood Harlan Vickers. "We're done playing games, Kane." Vickers shouted, "Hand her over easy, or we do this the hard way." Elijah raised a shotgun. "Get off my property. You're outnumbered, outgunned. No cavalry coming to save you. Don't need cavalry." Vickers nodded to his men. They advanced. Elijah fired. 1 man went down clutching his leg. The others scattered behind the trucks. Return fire shattered the farmhouse windows, sending splinters flying. He was going to lose. Too many of them, too many angles. He was going to die here, defending a horse that had saved his soul. Then, hoofbeats, thundering across snow. Midnight had jumped a fence. She galloped toward him, coat gleaming in moonlight, mane streaming like a banner. She reached the porch and pressed her flank against his body like a shield. And then sirens, red and blue lights flashing through darkness. Not one car, many. Sheriff Dawes' voice boomed through a megaphone. "Drop your weapons. You are surrounded." Chaos erupted. Vickers' men tried to run, but police swarmed everywhere. In the confusion, Midnight's head snapped up, tracking something. She galloped across the yard, and Elijah heard a human scream. He found her standing over Harlan Vickers. The man was on the ground, arm bent at an unnatural angle, face white with terror. Midnight stood over him, eyes blazing with fury. But she didn't strike, just pinned him there until police arrived. The horse caught him? Sheriff Dawes stared. "She's been waiting for this," Elijah said quietly. Later, the sheriff explained, an anonymous tip had mobilized state police hours earlier. Someone had detailed everything. Vickers' plan, the timeline, the number of men. Voice was disguised. Couldn't trace it. Elijah looked at Midnight, who was letting a young deputy scratch her ears. "Sometimes justice finds a way," he said. The battle was won. But somewhere out there, whoever made that call was watching. Harlan Vickers was arrested on charges of arson, animal cruelty, assault, and attempted murder. 7 of his men turned state's evidence. By Christmas, he was behind bars awaiting trial. And Elijah Kane was famous. News crews wanted interviews with a hero farmer and his miraculous black horse. The attention brought donations, enough to rebuild the barn, pay off back taxes, keep the farm running for years. It was January when the stranger appeared. A gray sedan pulled up. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, dark hair, winter sky eyes. She held herself like someone used to carrying heavy things. "Mr. Kane?" Her voice was soft but clear. "Who's asking?" She looked past him toward Midnight, grazing in the pasture. "She looks good. Better than I expected." Something in her tone made his skin prickle. "You know her?" She pulled out an old photograph. A young girl, maybe 12, laughing with her arms wrapped around a black foal. Her name was Starlight. I raised her from birth. She was the best friend I ever had. Her voice caught. "Vickers stole her when I was 16. My father owed him money." "You made that call," Elijah said. "Not a question." She nodded. "I've been watching Vickers for years. When I heard she'd escaped, that someone was protecting her, I had to help." "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Holloway." He held out his hand. "Come meet her." The reunion was quiet. Sarah walked slowly across the snowy pasture. Midnight stood still, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Then she nickered, soft, low, full of recognition. Nickering is a soft, low-pitched sound from both throat and nose. It's the sound a horse makes to say, "Yes, come closer." Sarah reached out. Midnight pressed her nose against her palm. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'm so sorry it took so long." She wrapped her arms around Midnight's neck and wept. Later, Sarah returned to Elijah at the fence. "She should go with you," he said. "She's yours." Sarah shook her head. "She was mine. Now she's yours, too." She smiled through tears. "Maybe we share her. Maybe family doesn't have to be blood. Just people who love the same things." Elijah looked at Midnight. She seemed to nod. "Call me Elijah," he said. That night, He sat on his porch watching stars, thinking about Margaret, about how she would love the story. "You like them both," he whispered to the empty air. The wind rustled through the old oak tree. It sounded like laughter. He had lost so much, but in the losing he'd found something unexpected, a reason to live again. Spring came early. Elijah planted his first crop in years. Wheat and corn, like his father and grandfather before him. Sarah returned in April, staying 2 weeks to help with planting. They talked about their past, their losses, their hopes. She told him about her husband, dead 5 years in a car accident, about the life she'd imagined and had to release, about how finding Midnight had healed something she thought was broken forever. "She saved me, too," Sarah said. "Just knowing she was alive kept me going." Summer was golden. The crops grew tall. Elijah bought 2 more rescue horses. Word spread. People called asking if he could take their damaged animals. The dying farm was coming back to life. The trial came in September. Elijah testified. So did Sarah. Harlan Vickers was found guilty on all counts. 25 years. Autumn was quiet. Sarah came and went, building a life between his farm and her city home. They talked about expanding the rescue operation, maybe writing a book. Every evening, Elijah walked to where Midnight waited. She was old now, maybe 5 good years left, the vet said, but Elijah thought only about now, about this moment, about her nose against his chest and her warm breath on his hands. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for saving me." 1 year later, the sign read Midnight's Haven, a sanctuary for horses and humans. 3 barns now, 27 horses, volunteers from across the state. But more than that, broken people came, lost people. They worked with horses and learned that healing was possible. On the anniversary of the trial, Sarah and Elijah stood on the hill overlooking the farm. Margaret's grave lay behind them, decorated with fresh flowers. "She would be proud," Sarah said. "Of all of us," Elijah replied. "All these broken pieces come together into something whole." Midnight walked slowly up the hill to join them. She turned and looked out at the farm she had helped create. Elijah put one hand on her neck. Sarah put hers beside his. 3 survivors stood together, watching the world turn golden. Midnight lived 8 more years. She died on a spring morning, peaceful, with Elijah's hand on her neck. They buried her on the hill next to Margaret, where she could watch over the farm forever. Today, Midnight's Haven has rescued over 300 horses. Thousands have walked through its gates seeking healing. And everyone learns the same lesson Elijah learned that stormy October night. Sometimes, the thing that saves you is the thing you save. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Everyone, horse and human alike, deserves one. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.